Today we'll be looking at how to write a summary. You'll be using summaries a lot in this course as you prepare your research paper. First of all, let's review what a summary is. A summary is a condensed version of a text. What kinds of things can be summarized? Well, summaries can be written for an entire text. For example, maybe you summarize an entire novel to share with your friend what the novel was about. Summaries can also be written for a part of a text. For example, your teachers might ask you to write a summary of a chapter in your textbook. And summaries can be written for ideas spread throughout a text. When you do summaries this way, you're looking for themes or thoughts that are mentioned several times in the text. For example, in a cookbook, you might summarize everything that was talked about in the cookbook about utensils. What are summaries used for? Well, you can use summaries to help readers decide whether they want to read the full version of the text. We'll be using summaries a lot this way later in the course when you try to decide what sources may be most helpful for your research, so keep this in mind for later. When you're writing summaries, you're using it to present a writer's main points in an abbreviated, condensed form. And also, you can use a summary to present a writer's main points or arguments or evidence in an abbreviated, condensed form for a purpose, so that you can use the arguments and evidence to support your own thinking. Let's look at an example of how you might present a writer's main points in an abbreviated, condensed form. For this example, we'll be using the reading Bittman's newspaper article. So if you haven't done that reading, you should go back immediately and read that before you view this portion of the slideshow. Here's a very brief summary of Bittman's main point. Bittman claims that citizens can't trust their government because it supports corporate profits, even at the expense of its people and the environment. Here, you're just getting at the kernel of the main idea that Bittman wants to get across. Here's a bit more developed summary. Bittman claims that the U.S. government is more interested in supporting corporate profits than protecting its people and the environment. For one thing, the government supports Monsanto in its promotion of genetically engineered crops, both at home and abroad, even though there are concerns that these crops support the generation of superweeds and superbugs. Additionally, the State Department supports the building of the Keystone XL oil pipeline, claiming that it won't have a significant impact on the environment, even though work unions, the Sierra Club, and scientists have protested that the pipeline is dangerous. Bittman calls citizens to fight for people in the environment, praising Bill McKibben's protest against the Keystone Pipeline and an upcoming march from New York to Washington to fight for the labeling of genetically altered food. Let's look at an example of how you might write a selective summary. In a selective summary, you choose different parts of a text to write about. You might summarize ideas about a certain topic in the text. Here's a selective summary of what Bittman has to say about genetically engineered foods. Bittman, 2001, points out that genetically altered foods can sometimes lead to the development of superbugs or superweeds. Additionally, not all countries support the use of genetically engineered foods. Even in our own country, several people are protesting to get the government to label genetically altered foods. Notice here that I haven't included anything about the Keystone XL pipeline because I'm doing a selective summary. I'm summarizing only the things that Bittman said about genetically engineered foods. Now, the best use of summary, and the use that you'll be using it for in your research papers, is to use selective summary to support an argument. In this case, you not only summarize what an author says, but you also use that summary to support your own ideas. Here's an example. The FDA needs to regulate genetically engineered foods because their safety for human consumption is controversial. Many other countries don't support the use of such foods for this very reason. Even in our own country, many people are protesting to get the government to label genetically altered foods. Bittman, 2001. With labels, consumers can decide for themselves whether or not they'd like to buy these foods. Let's look more closely at that selective summary to support an argument. Look at the words in red. The FDA needs to regulate genetically engineered foods because their safety for human consumption is controversial. That's the writer's idea. That's if somebody were writing a research paper on FDA regulations and genetically engineered foods, that sentence, the sentence in red, would be their own voice. That's not Bittman's voice. That's their own idea. Additionally, at the end of the paragraph, the writer expresses that when you have labels, it gives consumers better choice about whether or not they'd like to buy these foods. Again, what's happening here is that the writer is using the things Bittman said about genetically engineered foods to support their own ideas of what the FDA should do regarding genetically engineered foods. You want to get in your research writing to this point where you're summarizing other authors and what they say about your topic so that you can share your own ideas and thoughts about that topic. We'll develop the ability to do that as the course continues.